Happy New Year, everyone, and good evening. This is our first Oz Cyclone Chasers update for the 2014 year on the 1st of January 2014. My name's Chris Nitzo. Welcome, and tonight we're going to talk briefly about the life of Tropical Cyclone Christine. Then we're going to talk briefly about the Fijian region, which looks like it's going to fire up sometime in the next 5 to 7 days. And then after that, we'll talk about the Northern Territory and the new WA system, which is starting to appear likely to form around mid-January. Alright, let's get into it. So this is Tropical Cyclone Christine, and what was Tropical Cyclone Christine? Basically, it formed as a low on December 25, and we actually had two tropical lows at that time. We had this one here, and we had one here that the Bureau had warned for a potentially forming tropical cyclone right around Christmas Eve. And what we ended up happening was this low moved in this direction, this low moved in this direction, and they created one big giant low out here. Now that big giant low took a couple of days to actually get itself together and form into a tropical cyclone on December the 28th. Now on December the 28th, the system then travelled in a southwesterly direction and really didn't do anything surprising until possibly just about a couple of hours before landfall, where the eye wobbled to the west a little. Now that wobble of about 20 or 30 kilometres was enough to spare Port Hedland the worst of the storm surge, and was enough to and not enough to create the very destructive winds for Karratha. So it was sort of like a win-win situation for those two major settlements. Not a very win-win situation obviously for Wickham and Roebourne, who copped the worst of this system, and even Point Sampson to a certain extent, that copped the worst of this system. But it was certainly a dodged bullet for Port Hedland and Karratha, being the two major settlements in the area. So that was really the key, that last 20 or 30 kilometres before landfall, where it just jutted out to the west. The other little key here is between 8 p.m. December 29 and 8 a.m. December 30, the system had about 3 hours where it travelled southwards. And once again, those two issues conspired together to make sure that the system didn't attack any one of these centres head on. So thankfully it had a couple of hours here where it travelled south instead of south-southwest, and it had a couple of hours here where it travelled west instead of south or southwest, and therefore both of those things together have allowed the system to travel in a fairly sparsely populated region. Once again, I'm not trying to downplay the issue in Roebourne and also the issue in Wickham, but it could have been a fair bit worse had the system tracked straight over Karratha, or had the system tracked a little closer to Hedland, especially with Hedland being in that storm surge prone zone. Following on from that, the system remained a tropical cyclone for about 500 kilometres as it travelled inland. So it stayed a cyclone for a very long time. So it actually crossed around midnight, December the 31st. Look, you could have probably said it could have crossed anywhere from about 9 till midnight, because it was sort of just hugging, the edge of the eye was hugging the coast, as the coast was orientated west-southwest and the eye was pushing in the same direction. So midnight is what the Bureau have decided on as the crossing time, but as I say, you know, you could pretty well say that the system crossed anywhere from 9 till midnight. Alright, as we go through the coastal crossing details, 55 k's east of Karratha is where it actually crossed. At this stage, the Bureau have remained it as a Category 3. It is a very, very close Category 4 potential system. Maximum winds sustained were 155 kilometres an hour. The maximum wind gust 220, so just under Category 4. The lowest central pressure 950. The lowest one that we've seen data for is 952. So we haven't seen data for 950, but obviously the Bureau have estimated that the lowest in the centre of the system would be about 950. If we have a look, one last thing here is the Port Hedland. There's a buoy north of Port Hedland, and while the system was north of Port Hedland, this particular buoy, it seems very strange, and it does seem like an error. Did for some reason record wind speeds of up to 160, 170 knots. It just does not seem possible, but it is there, and so I'm sure the Bureau will be interested in analysing that further. It's shown wind speeds sustained over 10 minutes to be up to about 100 knots, which is about 160 kilometers an hour, which slightly is higher than what the Bureau have estimated. So once again, I'm sure the Bureau will be very keen to see this data and whether or not they can debunk it as being erroneous or whether it is actually factual. It's very interesting regardless. I mean, 160, 170 knots, you're talking, 300 kilometer an hour winds, which does seem very, very, very wrong. Especially when we start to look at the minimum pressure reported by the buoy, which was only 971 or 972 hectopascals. So really wasn't in the center. It was right on the edge of the eye wall. But still, those wind speeds do not equate with that central pressure. So I'm pretty sure that's wrong, but I'm sure the Bureau will need to check this out in a little bit more detail. And should they find that it's right, it could be upgraded to Category 4 if they decide that this wasn't an error. Okay, so the system is now tracking very, very quickly to the east or east-southeast as it's been captured by an upper level trough, and you can see the trough here. It really accelerated the system out here. Still packing a fair punch. It's still got gales to its potentially gales to its east, especially with the rapid speed that it's moving at. It actually enhances the wind speed at the surface, so we might actually see some gales still possible on the eastern semicircle of the system. Look, overall, it still packs a fair bit of rain with it. It's still pumping in a fair bit of moisture in from the north. But other than that, folks, that's the end of Christine. Christine is now the third tropical cyclone for Australia for the year. We had Alessia, then we had Bruce. Bruce became a Category 5, but harmlessly in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And look, at this stage we are seeing signs that there may be a fourth come mid-January, mid to late January. Something could form. Once again, we'll talk about that shortly. Overall, we're seeing Indonesia's continually firing with the monsoon trough. It's really going off over there, and we're seeing also the Solomon Islands. It's really firing up out there too. Right over the top of Australia, nothing happening monsoon-wise, and over the PNG region, nothing happening as well. So, but really the Solomon Islands firing and also the Indonesian region firing means that the monsoon is well and truly alive. It's just not alive in Australia. So overall, tomorrow we're going to expect monsoon break conditions over the northern parts of the continent. Not much rain happening over most of the northern parts of Australia. As we head to Friday, we continue to see monsoon break conditions, although we do start to see an increase in moisture over Queensland. And as we head towards Saturday and Sunday, we see deep low pressure regions forming just over the inland parts of northern Australia. Associated with this trough system. Once again, in a way, you could sort of attribute it half or partially to the ex-cyclone creating deep low pressure through the inland parts of Australia and creating a situation where it draws in moisture from the north, and so by Sunday we actually have a fairly decent trough system here over all of northern Australia, creating a lot of shower and storm activity over most of northern Australia. We also have a high coming in behind, pushing some dry southerly air by late in the weekend, but overall northern Australia is going to see an increase in activity in the day 4 to 8 period starting about Sunday. So what does that look like in terms of joined rainfall totals from the ensembles? Well, not much happening tomorrow at all, so we won't talk about it. As we head towards Friday, we see an increase in shower and storm activity to the point where it's fairly isolated, but spread out around the area. So it's not isolated and confined to very small areas. It is still isolated, so it's not going to be general, but we are going to see it over larger sections of the region. As we head to Saturday, we're going to see more and more moisture streaming into that trough system, and we're going to see showers and storms becoming more general, particularly over northern parts of Queensland, northern inland parts of Queensland, and also the central northern parts of the Northern Territory. And Sunday you can see those rainfall totals now really starting to ramp up over the northern parts of Australia, particularly over northern inland Queensland, which is fantastic news for them and the peninsula, who haven't seen much rain yet. So that's not quite making it to the coast, and it may make it to the coast after Sunday, but not quite yet on Sunday. But we are going to see some very good shower and storm activity over Northern Territory, North Kimberley and northern inland Queensland on the Sunday, and then that will further be enhanced as we head into the next 4-day period. So as we head to Monday to Thursday, we can see that we're going to see some very good rain and storm activity over most of inland Queensland, east of, say, the definitely east of about Longreach, but You know, this is an area, folks, that has missed out on a lot of rainfall in the build-up season, and this is the second year running that this area has missed out on a lot of rainfall. So this is very welcome rain for these guys in the day 4 to 8 period. Some of it even making it to the north tropical coast. Most of the central coast is going to miss out on most of the heavy stuff, but there's still going to be isolated showers and storms that, you know, hit this area between sort of Ingham and Maryborough. But really the heavy stuff is going to remain inland and the general stuff remaining inland. The Northern Territory is going to start to see an increase in that day 4 to 8 period, and let's talk about them now because things are starting to hot up there in the longer term. So by about next Thursday, we're starting to look at the potential for a tropical low to form in this part of the coast, or this part of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Now, as we head further in towards the Saturday, the 11th of January, we're going to see a situation here where the model is predicting generally lower pressure in this entire northern half of the continent. Now, with a special focus in the Northern Territory, this system at this stage looks likely to be trapped above a ridge over the central part of Australia, which will force the system to move in a westerly direction. So whatever happens out here will push to the west. Now, in the longer term, as we head towards mid-January, so this is now the 11th of January we're looking at, that area of lower pressure will push into the Timor Sea, or possibly just the generally southeast Indian Ocean region. Now, after that, we do expect, and most of the modelling in the longer term are expecting a decent tropical low or tropical cyclone to form in this region again around mid-January. Now, the other thing to note is that the South Pacific region here is obviously hotting up, and you can see that shown here by the darker shading, the darker colouring, showing that some of the model members are predicting a tropical low or cyclone to be in that area. Now, can I just state though that the European and the European ensemble are both, I guess, a little bit or very different to what the GFS ensemble is showing us. The GFS ensemble wants to form a tropical lower cyclone in the South Pacific region by the 11th of January. Now, over its model members, we're looking at 30 to 40% of them developing a tropical lower cyclone in this area. Now, that increases as we head to a larger time frame. So as we head towards the 13th and then the 14th, we're starting to look at a real sign from the GFS where almost 70 to 80% of model members are now forming a tropical cyclone in the Coral Sea or South Pacific in the extreme long term. Now, that's the 15th of January. Now, that's the same time that the European model is showing us a tropical lower cyclone forming on the west coast of Australia. So we are having massive model disagreements here between the GFS ensemble, which is showing a tropical lower cyclone in the Coral Sea, and the European ensemble, which is showing a tropical lower cyclone over Western Australia or Northern Territory region. So at this stage, folks, we can't tell you exactly which one of these is going to come off. What we can tell you is that the South Pacific over the next 5 to 7 days is going off, and we'll start to see a tropical lower cyclone form between sort of the Vanuatu and Fijian Islands and push in a southerly direction, not coming towards Australia, not going to affect Australia, even in the long term doesn't look like it's going to affect Australia. So what we're thinking at this stage is that perhaps the GFS ensemble is just getting a little confused between the tropical lower cyclone that's going to form in the Fijian area over the next 5 to 7 days and the longer term signal over the next 2 weeks, or the 2-week period, which is showing us multiple tropical lows and cyclones in this area. So at this stage we're going to stick with the European, but we are getting quite interested in the fact that so many GFS model members are predicting a cyclone in the Coral Sea. So it's not just one, they're all starting to show something happening out there. And when we've got that high an agreement, even though the GFS doesn't do real well, even when we have that high an agreement between all model members, or most model members, we do have to start paying attention. So mid-January looks like it's going to be interesting. We just don't know exactly for who. So we just don't know whether it's going to be interesting for WA, which is probably the most likely scenario right now, or whether it's going to be interesting for Queensland, which is the less likely scenario, but is the one being shown most aggressively by the GFS model. So if we take a look at the European high resolution model run for 10 days out, which is the 11th of January, we do see that tropical lower cyclone in the Vanuatu, or east of Vanuatu in the South Pacific. Now that's the one we're telling you will not come towards Australia. But at what we are seeing after that is that the European then forms a tropical lower cyclone in the 10 to 15 day period out here over WA. But the GFS model in that 10 to 15 day period forms a tropical lower cyclone in the Coral Sea. And that's what we're saying, is that we're not sure once we get past this period. So forget about this one. This one's not going to affect Australia. So yes, it is likely to form, something is likely to form in that area. It's not likely at this stage to be very intense according to most model guidance. But, it's still early days. If it does form into something more intense, we will inform our Fijian viewers about it. But at this stage, it looks like it's going to be weak, whatever it is there. But in the longer term is what we're interested in, and as I say, we're really stuck between something forming here in the 10 to 15 day period and something forming here in the 14 to sort of 18 day period. So that's really what we're struggling with, and that's really what models are struggling with. Let's just say mid-January, mid sort of that 15th to 20 to 22 January is going to be a very interesting time period for either the west or the east coasts of Australia. Alright folks, that's all we've got time for tonight. We'll talk to you again now. Because we've got no cyclone threats, we'll go back to issuing twice weeklies, and remember, our twice weeklies get issued on Tuesdays and Fridays, so our next update will be on Friday. Thanks very much for watching tonight, and we do hope that if you have been affected by Tropical Cyclone Christine, you are on the road to recovery. Thankfully, we've heard that there's been no real casualties, no fatalities, which is fantastic, but there has been a fair bit of damage in those places that it did hit. Good night, folks, and we'll talk to you again Friday.